In the previous video, we have designed one registration form. In this registration form, the user will enter the data, and the data which is entered by the user is displayed back onto the web browser. In that case, we have created two JSP pages. The first page was the register.jsp to display the registration form, and the second page was details.jsp to display the details of the user. Whenever the user fills the form data and submit it, the controller, the handler within the controller handles or collects the data with the help of this annotation request param. So if there are 4 text fields within this form, then we have to use the request params 4 times. Then the controller use the model object and put all the collected data which is collected with the help of the form by the user, put this all data into the model object and send this model object to the JSP page. Then JSP page retrieves the data from the model object and display that data to the client. But there was one problem which I have indicated in that video. If form contains 10 text fields, then it will be very laborious task to use this request param 10 times. But there is also one demerit of using this type of technology to collect the user data into the different variables like fname, lname, email and mobile. Because whenever the user submits the data, this data is not a sort of the scattered data. Scattered data means this first name and last name are not independent. This is the last name of a person whose first name is this. Like this email is not an independent variable. This email do not belongs to somebody, but it belongs to the entity whose first name is this and last name is this. This mobile number is not independent. This mobile number belongs to the user whose first name is this, last name is this and email is this. It means we have to bind this complete data to a single entity. This data cannot be kept separately, either separately first name, separately last name, separately email or separately mobile number. This data should be bind under a one single name. For example, we create one entity user and we bind that all data into a single entity like we have shown here. All the data is now binded to the single entity, that is the user. Nowadays, when we design our applications, then our application or our system contains the different layers, because if we talk about the controller collects the data which is submitted by the user and it also processes the data, performs some business logic or wants to save the data into the persistent storage. So we have divided the responsibilities, the different responsibilities to the different components which belongs to the different layers. So this type of architecture is known as the layered architecture. Now, if a controller wants to persist some data which is submitted by user into the database, and before persisting the data it wants to perform some computations on the data, then all those computations will be done by the service layer. Only the data will be handled or the data will be handed over to the service layer. Then that service layer, after the computation, wants to persist the data. For persisting the data, it will take the help of this database layer or the data access object layer. Now for that it will hand over the entity to the DO like this. Whenever the data is received by the controller which is submitted by the user, the controller hands over this data to the service layer. One more important point to be noted here, these layers, these are the 5 layers. Like this is the presentation layer which controls which is having the view inside it, presentation layer, then different layer controller, different layer service layer, DO layer and the persistence layer. Now these layers are independent layers. How these layer communicates with each other? These layers communicate with each other by passing the objects between them. Like if the data is collected by the view, it will pass that particular data under the single entity name to the controller, under the single entity name. Now controller will pass that data to the service layer. So these layers are communicating with each other by passing the objects or by passing the entities. Now any permutation which is done will be done in the service layer. Now if this object or this entity wants to be persisted into the database, then service layer will not do it itself, but it will take the services of the DO layer. So it will hand over the object to the DO. Now DO will persist this object into the database. Now same is the reverse. If view wants to get the details of some entity, it will pass the primary key of the entity. It will first go to controller, from controller to service layer, from service layer to DO. Then DO will inquire or search the database or fire a query to search for a particular entity in the database. Then database returns that entity. Then DO hand over that entity to the service layer. Then service layer hand over that entity to the controller, and controller hand over that entity to the view. So the data should not be scattered, it should be assembled into a single entity, because data belongs to the entity, and these layers communicate with each other with the help of these entities. So now what we are going to do is, the data which we have collected in the previous video tutorial will now belong to a single entity. For that we will create one more class, and at the server side we are going, or in the controller part, we are going to get that particular entity. Now here we have designed one registration form which was having 4 fields: fname, lname, email and mobile number. Now what we will do in this Java package, we will create one class, and the name of the class will be user, and we will place this user class into the package name model, because this is going to be the model of our project. Model. Now we click finish. Now in this user class we will create the private properties of the user, like first property is fname. The first property is fname, and the second property is lname. This is the second property of the user, and the fourth property is email. So we create either fourth property is email, and then the last property is mobile. Last property is mobile. So last property is mobile. Now for these properties we will generate the getters and setters. So generate the getters and setter methods for all of these properties. Select all. Okay. Now the getters and setters has been generated. Okay. Now we come to the controller part. Here what we have done in the controller, we have to open user controller. What we have done in the controller, we have collected the user data in the form of param. So we will delete all these params and create one single object, that is user. It means the data which is submitted by the user belongs to this entity, and the name of the entity is user. I have to import this entity from the model, but we should be confirm that whatever the name of the text field are here, like fname, lname, email and mobile number, our model object should contains the properties exactly with those names, or the property names or the text field name should match. If there are 4 text field, then there should be 4 properties here, and the name of these text field and these properties should be same. Now as we have now this controller is taking this user object as a parameter. Now in the fname we want to put the username. So here we will get user dot get fname. Get fname. As we have generated the getters and setters, So we will use the get property to get the L name, and here we will use user.get email, and here I will use user.get mobile. Now we have placed all the properties within the model object. Now here we have removed all the request params and we have used a single model object. So whenever the data is submitted to this controller we see that he has to assemble all the data into the model object. Then it will verify the properties of this model object, whether these properties are same as that of the submitted data. If they are same, it will bind the properties one by one to the submitted data. Now all the properties will get its value, like this property fname, this data fname will be assigned to this property fname, and so on. Now we can do one more thing. As we can see that this is a user controller and all the handlers will contain this /user in their handler mapping. So we will move this handler mapping to the class level. Now this user we will remove from here and place here. Now there is no need to write this handler mapping here. Now whenever the dispatcher servlet matches for a handler or searches for a handler, first it will search for a class level handler mapping. This is the class level handler mapping and this is the method level handler mapping. So if we find that there is a class level handler mapping, so it will first use that handler mapping and then the method handler mapping is appended after this. So this handler will be mapped to /user/register and this handler will map to /user and /details. Now we are done. So we have created one model object and we are going to collect this data into the model. Now we run this, run on server, restart server. Okay, now the page is displayed. We copy this handler mapping register, and then before register we have to add user, the handler mapping which is done at the class level. And note one thing also, we have not altered any of the JSP files. We have not altered any of the JSP files. We have only altered the controllers. So the form is displayed. Now if I mention here Rod Johnson and email rod@gmail.com and then mobile number 12345678910910 and then enter add, I will get the same page. Now the data is saved into the single entity named user. So if you compare this with this presentation, now this is our entity user. Whenever the view submits the data, this data contains 4 fields. Now what controller does, a controller saves all the data into the single entity, that is the user, as we have discussed here that the all data belongs to the single entity user. Okay, now but there are some more to be done, and we have studied the several layers communication happens between them by exchanging entities or the model objects. In the next video we will learn how to integrate Spring with Hibernate. But what need more to be done, as we have designed the form like this, now validations need to be performed with this particular data. This is the major responsibility, or developers finds this problem always while validating the user's data. Like if some of the fields are left blank and they are mandatory and the blank fields cannot be submitted to the controller, and we have also to validate the data, whether this email is a valid email, whether this mobile number is a valid mobile number. So what I'm planning to do, in the next tutorial we will study how to validate the user data which is submitted in the form. But for that we have to provide the validations, and we will also study how to process this data into the database, like how to perform the create, update, read or delete option within the database. Now for that we will use the Hibernate as our ORM for accessing the database. So in the next tutorial we will integrate the Hibernate, and also I am introducing Hibernate at this point is because for the validation purpose, like for the form validation, I am going to use the Hibernate validations, because they are some of the annotations which are provided by the Hibernate validation validator API, or the Hibernate validator.jar, which we will be using in the next tutorial. So to study the validation and to get through how to perform the create, read, update and delete operations in the database, we will first learn how to integrate this Hibernate ORM with your Spring framework.